Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be looking at something pretty important, and that's the educational journey of Hispanic-Americans after 1945.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, and we've got a lot of great material to dig through.
Awesome.
We've got legal cases, we've got historical analyses, even some personal accounts.
Wow.
All painting a picture of, the wins, the struggles, and how these communities have been fighting for a place in the American dream.
I'm excited to dive in.
Me too. And, it's a story with a lot of twists and turns. And I think one of the most surprising things is that the first successful school desegregation case in the U.S. didn't happen with Brown v. Board of Education.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it actually happened way back in 1931 in California.
I did not know that.
I know, crazy, right?
Yeah.
So this case, Alvarez v. Owen, really sets the stage for all the legal battles that were to come. It all went down in Lemon Grove, California, where the school board decided to segregate Mexican-American children, and they tried to justify it by saying it was for their own good.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, can you believe that?
Huh.
But the community, that weren't having it. They took the school board to court, and they won.
That's amazing.
In this case, it established this really important principle. Separate but equal is inherently unequal.
And that was decades before Brown v. Board.
Decades. It's incredible how this seemingly small-town case had such a huge impact on the legal landscape.
Absolutely. And it really shows how these local struggles can have these ripple effects throughout history, setting precedents and shaping national conversations.
For sure. And that momentum, it continued with Delgado v. Bastrop ISD in 1948.
Right.
This one further strengthened the legal arguments against segregation, this time in Texas.
These early victories are so important. They show that communities can actually challenge these discriminatory practices and win even when they're facing deeply ingrained prejudice.
Definitely. It's inspiring, but here's where things get a little more complicated. Even as legal segregation was being dismantled, a new kind of separation emerged.
Oh.
De facto segregation.
What was that?
Well, think of it like this. Segregation, not by law, but by design. Like you had housing policies, economic disparities, all these things kind of working together to keep schools segregated, even though the law said they shouldn't be.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it's a really tricky issue.
It is. A major factor in this was what they call white flight. So as schools started integrating, white families moved to the suburbs.
Right.
And this left a lot of urban schools with a much higher concentration of minority students.
And the numbers really tell that story, don't they?
They do. Between 1968 and 1995, the percentage of Latino students in predominantly minority schools, it jumped from 55% to a whopping 74%.
That's a huge increase.
It is.
So even though the laws were changing the reality for a lot of Hispanic-American students remained a struggle.
Exactly. And it really makes you question whether simply dismantling legal barriers is enough to achieve true equality.
It's a question that has been debated for decades.
Yeah. In fact, it was so concerning that in 1996, a presidential commission actually declared a state of crisis in Latino educational attainment.
Wow.
Yeah, they recognized that there were still these deep inequalities, persistent lower graduation rates, higher dropout rates, and limited access to higher education.
Yeah.
It was a pretty bleak picture.
It's heartbreaking when you think about all the potential that's being lost because of these disparities.
It is.
And this takes us to a period of intense policy battles and backlash.
I can imagine.
Yeah, there was progress, but also a lot of pushback as people fought for educational equality.
Right.
One case that really stands out from this era is Plyler v. Doe in 1982.
Okay.
And this one focused on the education of undocumented children.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a landmark case.
Right.
The Supreme Court ruled that denying undocumented children access to public education was unconstitutional.
Wow.
They recognized that educating all children benefits society regardless of their immigration status.
It's a decision that still resonates today, especially with all the debates about immigration and education.
It does make you think about our values as a society, doesn't it?
It does.
Like, how do we choose to invest in the future? And speaking of investments, another big area that sparked a lot of debate was bilingual education.
Oh, yeah?
Initially, there was a lot of support for these programs.
Oh.
You had the Bilingual Education Acts of 1968 and 1974 providing federal funding.
Right.
And then there was Lau v. Nichols in 1974, which further emphasized the need to address language differences in education.
Yeah, the court basically said, look, just handing all students the same materials isn't good enough. Students who have limited English proficiency, They need extra support if they're going to really access the curriculum.
It makes sense.
It does.
But as often happens, when there's progress, there's also pushback.
Right.
And this whole debate about language and education, it's still going on today.
For sure.
Like, how do we balance supporting cultural identity with preparing students for a world that often prioritizes English? It's a tough question.
It is.
And that pushback, it kind of culminated in California's Proposition 227 in 1998.
What did that do?
Well, it basically mandated English-only instruction in public schools.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a big setback for those who supported bilingual education.
It sounds like it.
And it's a classic example of how even well-intentioned policies can have unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
So we've gone from legal victories against segregation to the complexities of de facto segregation, and now this whole debate about language and education.
It's a lot.
It is. And it shows that the journey towards educational equity has been anything but straightforward.
For sure.
And this brings us to another complex issue.
Oh.
Affirmative action.
Okay.
So the goal of affirmative action was to try and address the disadvantages that minority groups faced historically,
Right.
including in higher education.
Makes sense.
In the 70s and 80s, these policies did help increase the number of Hispanic students going to college.
Okay.
But then in the 90s, there was a backlash.
Oh.
Yeah, and this led to things like Proposition 209 in California.
I've heard of that.
It basically banned the use of race or ethnicity in college admissions. And the impact was almost immediate. A lot of California universities saw a big drop in Hispanic enrollment.
That's significant.
It was. It really highlighted this tension between wanting to promote diversity and concerns about fairness in the college admissions process.
Right. Right.
But even with these challenges, there were some pretty creative solutions that came up.
Like what?
Well, like the top 10% rule in Texas.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that, but I don't really understand how it worked.
So basically, Latino legislators in Texas, they were able to implement this rule that guaranteed admission to state universities for the top 10% of graduates from every high school in Texas.
So it didn't matter what your background was or the school's demographics?
Nope, they all got in.
That's pretty clever.
It was a way to kind of exploit a system that was initially designed for segregation and use it to actually promote diversity.
Wow. It just goes to show that even within these rigid systems, there's still room for creative solutions.
Absolutely. And it's a good reminder that policymakers can find ways to promote opportunity even when the system seems stacked against certain groups.
I like that.
So we've covered a lot of ground, but one thing we can't ignore when we talk about equal opportunities is how schools are financed.
Right.
This is where things get really unequal for a lot of students.
Yeah, school funding, it's often seen as this boring technical topic.
I know.
But it's actually crucial to understanding why these disparities persist.
Totally.
See, in the U.S., we rely heavily on local property taxes to fund schools.
Right.
Which means schools in wealthier neighborhoods, they often have way more resources than schools in predominantly Latino and low-income communities.
It creates this uneven playing field.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So even though everyone theoretically has access to public education, the quality of that education can be vastly different depending on where you live.
Yeah, it's like having access to a race car but only getting a bicycle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this disparity affects everything from teacher quality and class sizes to the availability of extracurricular activities and advanced courses.
It's a cycle, isn't it?
Yeah, it's this vicious cycle where underfunded schools lead to fewer opportunities, which then perpetuates poverty and limits future prospects.
It makes you think about how even policies that seem neutral can be weapons when they're built on this foundation of inequality.
You said it.
So what do you think needs to change to level the playing field?
That's a big question, one that probably deserves its own deep dive.
Maybe we'll do that next time.
But I think one thing's for sure. We need to move beyond just providing equal access and start thinking about creating equal opportunity.
I agree. It's not just about opening the doors. It's about making sure everyone has a real chance to succeed once they're inside.
Exactly.
And we need to hear from different voices, different perspectives to really grasp the scope of this challenge.
I couldn't agree more.
So in our next segment, we're going to do just that.
Oh.
We're going to explore those different historical perspectives. We'll hear from the progressive school, the social history school, critical race theorists, and postcolonial scholars.
That's fascinating.
It is. Each one offers a unique lens through which to view this complex history. So stay tuned.
Will do.
All right, so we're back and ready to dig into these different historical perspectives.
Yeah, I'm excited for this.
Me too. It's like we're putting on different pairs of glasses, right?
Uh-huh.
Each one revealing a new aspect of the same picture.
Exactly. And it's through these different lenses that we can really get a better understanding of the challenges and the successes in this story.
Okay, so let's start with the progressive school of thought. What's their take on all of this?
Well, progressive historians, people like Juan Gonzalez, they acknowledge the legal wins that we talked about earlier, but they also emphasize that those victories didn't just magically wipe away the deep inequalities that still existed.
Makes sense.
Yeah, for them, it's not just about changing laws. It's about addressing the systemic barriers that are preventing real equality.
So even though things were changing legally, the actual reality for a lot of Hispanic-American students was still far from ideal.
Exactly. It wasn't like problem solved.
Yep.
Things like underfunded schools, the backlash against bilingual education, and the fact that de facto segregation was still happening all played a role in maintaining that uneven playing field.
Right. So it's like one step forward, two steps back kind of thing.
Yeah, in a way.
It's
And this is where the social history school comes in.
okay. What do they focus on?
Well, they're all about the power of people.
I like that.
Yeah, the grassroots activism, the community organizing that pushed for change in education.
It's a good reminder that change doesn't only happen in courtrooms or government buildings.
For sure. It happens when people demand better for themselves and their kids.
I love that.
Historians like Vicky Ruiz, they highlight how important parent groups, student activists, and community organizations were in this fight.
Yeah, they were the ones out there on the front line.
They were. They fought for things like bilingual programs and protections for undocumented children.
Right. And they brought this human element to the forefront, reminding us that these aren't just abstract policy debates.
Absolutely. They're about real people fighting for a fair shot.
Their stories are so inspiring. It shows how even ordinary people can have a huge impact.
Totally. And then we have critical race theory, which takes a slightly different approach.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about critical race theory.
It's been getting a lot of attention lately.
It has. It seems like they're looking at the bigger picture, right?
They are. They're focused on the systems and policies that are creating and perpetuating these disparities.
So it's not just about individual prejudice.
No,
It's about how the systems themselves can be biased.
exactly.
Yeah.
Even if that's not the intention.
That's kind of a heavy thought, isn't it?
It is. But it's important to understand how these systems work so we can start to change them.
I agree. And then there's the post-colonial school of thought, which adds another layer of complexity.
Yeah, they bring in this global context. They
Right.
connect this whole story to bigger patterns of colonialism and its legacy.
So they're saying these issues aren't isolated.
Right. They're tied to these historical and global forces.
I'm really curious to hear more about that.
Well, thinkers like Ramon Grossfogel, they argue that the challenges Hispanic-American students face are actually part of a bigger pattern of what's called neocolonialism.
Neocolonialism.
Yeah, it's basically the ways in which powerful countries continue to exert control over former colonies, even after those colonies have gained independence.
So even though these countries are politically independent, there's still this economic and cultural dominance at play.
Exactly. And in the context of education, this can show up in a few ways. Like you might have a Eurocentric curriculum that doesn't reflect the histories and experiences of diverse students.
Right.
Or you might see the devaluation of languages other than English.
So it's like this subtle but powerful way of maintaining control.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it reminds us that these issues are all interconnected.
Totally.
It's not about just fixing one thing. It's about addressing the root causes of inequality at every level.
So we have these 4 different schools of thought: progressive, social history, critical race theory, and postcolonial.
Quite a range.
It is. They all provide a unique perspective. Which one resonates most with you?
That's tough. They all bring something important to the table.
Mm-hmm.
I think what really matters is that we engage with all of these perspectives.
Yeah, I agree.
We need to listen to the different voices and experiences of the people who have been most affected by these systems.
So it's not about choosing sides.
Nope. It's about understanding the complexity of the issue.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to the question of what we can actually do to make a difference.
Right.
We've talked about the problems, the history, the different ways of looking at things.
Uh-huh.
But what are the solutions? Where do we go from here?
Well, I think one of the most crucial things is to shift our mindset.
Okay.
Instead of just focusing on providing equal access, we need to think about creating equal opportunity.
That's a really important distinction. Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. So equal access basically means everyone has the same theoretical right to something.
In this case, education.
Right. But equal opportunity means that everyone has a genuine chance to succeed, regardless of their background or the circumstances they were born into.
So it's about recognizing that not everyone starts from the same place.
Exactly.
Ugh.
And to do that, we need to address those systemic barriers that we've been discussing.
Like the elephant in the room. School funding.
Uh-huh.
We've talked about how the current system, which relies so much on property taxes, it just creates this cycle of inequality.
It does.
So what's the alternative? How do we create a funding system that's actually fair?
Well, there are a few different models out there. Some people advocate for a more centralized funding system.
Oh.
So instead of relying on local property taxes,
Right.
which can vary a lot from one district to the next,
Yeah.
we'd have a system where resources are distributed more evenly at the state or even federal level.
That makes sense. So schools in lower income areas would have the resources they need to provide a quality education.
Exactly. And then there are weighted funding formulas.
Yeah.
Well, these formulas take into account the specific needs of students.
Okay.
So they provide extra resources to schools that have a lot of students living in poverty, or English language learners, or students with disabilities.
So it's acknowledging that some students need more support than others to succeed?
Exactly.
But it's not just about throwing money at the problem, right?
No, we need to be strategic with our investments. We need to make sure the resources are actually reaching the students who need them most.
Absolutely. And funding is only part of the equation.
Right.
We also need to address de facto segregation, which, as we've seen, concentrates poverty and limits opportunities for students.
Oh, sure.
We talked about white flight earlier, but how do we actually reverse that trend? How do we create schools that are more integrated and diverse?
It's a big challenge, but it's not impossible. It requires both policy changes and community initiatives.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, we need to invest in affordable housing in more affluent neighborhoods.
That way, families who want to live in those areas and send their kids to those schools can actually afford to do so.
Exactly. And we need to create incentives for families to choose diverse schools.
How do we do that?
Well, maybe through magnet programs or other creative approaches.
Yeah, okay.
But it's not just about changing where people live or go to school.
Right.
It's about addressing the underlying reasons why residential segregation happens in the first place.
Like what?
Things like discriminatory lending practices or zoning laws that keep certain communities out of certain neighborhoods.
Wow, it's a lot to unpack.
It is. There are so many interconnected factors contributing to this issue.
It feels a bit like a tangled web.
It does. But the good news is that by untangling those threads, by understanding how all these pieces fit together, we can start to figure out some real solutions.
That's encouraging. And that brings us to another important piece of the puzzle, the learning environment itself.
Yeah.
So we've talked about funding and desegregation. What else do we need to consider when we're trying to create schools that are truly equitable?
We need to create learning environments that are inclusive and welcoming to all students,
That makes sense.
no matter their background, their language, their culture.
So it's about more than just getting students in the same building.
Exactly. It's about making sure those schools are places where everyone feels valued and respected.
Absolutely.
We need to move beyond this idea of one-size-fits-all education.
Right.
We need to recognize that different students have different needs and different learning styles.
It's about celebrating diversity, not trying to erase it.
Exactly. And that brings us back to our listeners.
Okay.
What can each of us do individually to contribute to a more equitable future?
That's a great question. Sometimes it feels like these problems are just too big. Like what can one person really do?
I understand that feeling, but it all starts with awareness.
Okay.
Educate yourself about the issues, the history, the different perspectives we've been talking about,
Right.
and then get involved in your community.
What do you mean?
Well, support organizations that are working to improve education for Hispanic-American students. Advocate for policy changes at the local, state, and national levels.
So use your voice and your actions to push for change.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And don't underestimate the impact of those smaller actions either.
Like what?
Well, you could mentor a student volunteer at a local school, or even just have conversations with your friends and family about these issues.
So even just talking about it can make a difference.
It can. You'd be surprised how many people aren't even aware of how unequal our education system is.
It's about raising awareness and planting those seeds for change.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for those who want to get more directly involved, mentoring can be incredibly powerful.
Yeah, I've heard that.
There are a lot of organizations that connect caring adults with students who need a little extra support and guidance.
Especially for those who might not have positive role models or who are facing challenges outside of school.
Yeah, it's all about showing up for someone believing in their potential and helping them navigate the world of education.
And you don't have to be an expert to be a mentor.
Nope. Sometimes just listening and offering encouragement can make a world of difference.
It's about those human connections.
It is. And if you're able to donate to organizations working on these issues, that's another great way to help.
Yeah, every little bit counts.
It does. Whether it's providing books and supplies to schools, supporting scholarships for college students, or funding research to better understand these issues.
Every dollar can make a difference.
It really can. And remember, systemic change, it starts with individual actions.
Right.
By getting involved, raising your voice, mentoring students, and supporting organizations dedicated to this cause, you become part of the solution.
It's good to know that we're not powerless.
We're not. We can all be agents of change, working together to create a future where every student has the chance to thrive.
That's a beautiful thought.
It has been a really insightful journey exploring this topic with you.
I agree.
I hope our listeners feel inspired and ready to take action.
Me too. To all our deep divers out there, thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
Remember, the fight for educational equity is a marathon, not a sprint. It's an ongoing process, and it needs all of us to participate.
You can do this.
We can. So let's keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better future for all students. All right, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive. And after, going through all the complexities of this issue, I'm really eager to talk about what we can actually do to create a more equitable educational landscape for Hispanic-Americans.
Me too.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this.
It is.
But I truly believe that even small actions can make a difference.
I agree. It's all about moving from awareness to action.
Exactly. So we've talked about the history, the systemic issues, the different perspectives. Now let's talk solutions. How can we actually make a difference?
Well, one of the most impactful things you can do is to become an advocate for change in your own community.
Okay.
Start by connecting with local organizations that are already working to address these educational inequalities.
So like finding those groups that are already out there making a difference?
Exactly. There are groups focused on everything from early childhood education to helping students get into college.
Right.
And they're always looking for people who are passionate about this issue to volunteer or just show their support.
So find what speaks to you and lend your time, skills, or resources.
Exactly. And don't forget about the power of your own voice.
What do you mean?
I mean, educate yourself about the challenges facing Hispanic students in your local school district.
Okay.
Go to school board meetings. Talk about the funding disparities. Advocate for policies that promote inclusive learning environments and culturally responsive teaching.
So make your voice heard where decisions are being made.
Exactly. Hold those in power accountable for creating equitable systems.
It's about pushing for change from within the system.
It is. And advocacy isn't limited to those formal settings either.
Right.
Talk to your friends, family, neighbors about these issues.
Just bring it up in conversation.
Yeah, share what you've learned from this deep dive. You'd be surprised how many people are completely unaware of just how unequal our education system is.
It's about starting those conversations and raising awareness, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can plant the seeds for change just by talking about these things.
That's powerful. And for those who are looking for a more hands-on approach, what about mentoring?
Mentoring is amazing.
Yeah.
There are so many organizations that connect caring adults with students who need a little extra support and guidance.
Especially for students who might not have those positive role models or who are facing all sorts of challenges outside of school.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you don't need to have all the answers or be an expert in anything specific.
Right. It's not about being perfect.
No, not at all.
Mm.
Sometimes just listening to a student and offering encouragement can make a huge difference.
It's about that human connection.
Yeah, letting them know they're not alone.
And for those who are able to give financially, donating to organizations that are working to improve education for Hispanic-American students is another great way to contribute.
Every dollar makes a difference.
It does.
Whether it's providing books and supplies, supporting scholarships for college, or funding research to help us better understand these issues.
It all adds up.
Absolutely.
Right.
And at the end of the day, remember that systemic change starts with individual actions.
Right.
So by getting involved, by raising your voice, by mentoring students, by supporting these organizations, you become a part of the solution.
It's empowering to know that we're not powerless in the face of these huge challenges.
No.
We can all do something.
We can.
And together, we can create a future where all students, regardless of their background, have the opportunity to thrive.
It's been an amazing experience exploring this topic with you.
I agree. And to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this educational journey.
Thank you.
Remember, the fight for educational equity is a marathon, not a sprint.
It's a long game.
It is, and it needs all of us to keep going. So let's keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better future for all students.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.